This evening, we welcome MC Sullivan. She's a nurse, a bioethicist, say if you can say that 5 times quickly, an attorney who is presently the director of the newly established Initiative for Palliative Care and Advanced Care Planning for the Archdiocese of Boston. She's provided professional education in ethics and has consulted with healthcare providers on urgent patient care. Attorney Sullivan has earned a BA in philosophy from Emmanuel College, a master's in theological studies and ethics from Harvard University, a Doctor of Law degree from the Massachusetts School of Law, and is admitted to the bar in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In her spare time, she also became a registered nurse and practiced critical care. This evening, Attorney Sullivan will bring an important Catholic perspective on the issue of palliative care, what it is, and why I think it's so important for us as we discuss it in light of the Church. And so on behalf of our communities here on the Cape, welcome Attorney Sullivan.
Thank you, Monsignor. I am thrilled to be here, and that was a very gracious introduction. When I get those lovely, gracious introductions, I always think of my mother, because she would be really proud of me, and we can ask her about that tonight. She's here with us. She hates it when I do that, but there she sits. She's amazing. I also want to thank, in addition to that lovely introduction, Monsignor Avila, I'd like to thank Monsignor Hoy in absentia for extending the invitation, to Father Healy, my former pastor, for keeping the commitment, and most particularly to Judy Warren, who really was incredibly helpful in getting the mechanics and the details covered this week. So thanks, I'm thrilled to be here. So as you heard, I am the newly appointed director of a newly established initiative in your neighboring diocese, the Archdiocese of Boston. This was a brainchild of Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who, when he was Bishop of Fall River, really acquainted himself with and committed himself to what was then a newly established subspecialty in medicine called palliative care. He was really one of the early adopters, as the marketing community would tell us, and he has remained firmly committed to it ever since. So we have this wonderful initiative, and we have the slides moving as well. Many people have said to me, you know, the Archdiocese is not itself a healthcare organization, so why do we have an initiative in palliative care? And there are a lot of reasons, but I've tried to summarize them in a few concise points. First of all, we believe that palliative care is in and of itself a good. It lifts out, it considers, it assesses the needs for every aspect of what makes us human. Because when we talk about palliative care, we're considering the physical symptoms that people with serious illness suffer. We are talking about the psychological impact and the psychosocial impact on relationships, on family, on finances. We understand that people are on an emotional roller coaster as they deal with serious illness. And most importantly, in the Catholic community, we understand that there are many times when the most important thing that we can offer people with serious illness is spiritual care and spiritual support. For any of you who have been diagnosed with a serious illness or have cared for a loved one with serious illness, you know that in the shocking moment of diagnosis, we often ask ourselves, why me? What have I done wrong? We have feelings of abandonment. We immediately have feelings of being the other. The normal life that we had been living and that we see lived all around us is no longer ours, we think. And so in Catholic healthcare and in our Catholic faith communities, we put a special emphasis on spiritual care. But what's really important for all of us to know is that in the subspecialty of palliative medicine and palliative nursing, there is the same kind of emphasis on spiritual care. It is not unique to faith communities. And that's important because it's one of the reasons that makes palliative care so attractive to us and so attractive to the Church. In the context of palliative care, we look at the world of the patient with serious illness as focused around the patient, But we understand in our Catholic anthropology that we are informed by our relationships. We are who we are because of the friendships we have, because of the loving network of support that we live in and depend on. And in palliative care, that network is included. So while things are patient-focused, they're also family-oriented in whatever way we define family. In this mobile world that we live in, oftentimes it's friends or colleagues, former coworkers who became friends that are the handiest and are often sometimes the most supportive. So palliative care is wonderful for the patient, incredibly helpful and supportive for the network of caregivers around that patient, and therefore it's a benefit to the community, and we in the church recognize that. Another reason for palliative care. We understand, and I mentioned it a moment ago, that we are who we are because of the relationships that we have. The relationships first and foremost with our birth family, be they good or bad, they shape us. With our neighbors, with our parish, with our town and community, the ever-widening circle of those people that make us who we are, with our teachers and classmates, with our colleagues. And as I said, palliative care takes care of all of that because even while we are patient-driven and family-oriented, we also look into the nature of those relationships to see what needs to be tended to in the course of a serious illness, because in becoming well, we have to pay attention to our morale, we have to pay attention to our psychological and social aspects as well. So, we also have palliative care because even when medical treatment is unable to defeat a serious illness, all its possibilities are then directed to the alleviation of suffering. And suffering includes not just physiological pain, but also moral pain, moral distress, emotional distress, and spiritual distress. We've talked about the kind of aspects of this before, but St. John Paul articulates it beautifully. These are his quotes, particularly in the early stages of illness when proportionate and effective treatment is no longer possible. While it is necessary to avoid every kind of persistent or aggressive treatment, methods of palliative care are required. I'm reading you these quotes because it's important for us to know in a world where there is misunderstanding about what palliative care is, and you notice we haven't defined it yet, but we will do, there is some reluctance, and particularly in the Catholic community, to embrace palliative care. I think that reluctance and that resistance comes out of a misunderstanding. But what's important about these couple of slides that I'm showing you now is that since the advent of palliative care as a specialty, every pope who has sat on the chair of Peter has not only endorsed it, but has exhorted us to implement it, to adopt it, to practice it. So rather than this being something that's at odds somehow with Catholic teaching, it actually, I believe, is the embodiment of Catholic teaching for all the reasons that I gave you in the first couple of slides. John Paul goes on to say, in fact, palliative care aims, especially in the case of patients with terminal diseases, but not exclusively, at alleviating a vast gamut of symptoms of physical, psychological, and mental suffering. Hence, it requires the intervention of a team of specialists with medical, psychological, and religious qualifications who will work together to support the patient in critical stages. The thing that's so impressive about palliative care is that it is a method of treatment that implements a plan that is both constructed by and carried out by an interdisciplinary team of healthcare professionals. They come together from medicine, from nursing, from psychiatry, from chaplaincy, from social work, and from any other specialties that are required for the particular care of the particular patient, and they work together. They construct a plan together, they implement it together, and they assess it together so that together they can make the necessary adjustments. Benedict XVI was particularly eloquent, I thought. The Church wishes to support the incurably and terminally ill by calling for just social policies. Now this is interesting. You know, the Catholic Church is known for its Catholic social teaching because, as I said in the first part of my remarks, we are relational beings. We are social beings. We are both shaped by those relationships, informed by those relationships, but also supported and nurtured by those relationships. So Benedict calls on just social policies which can help to eliminate the causes of many diseases, and by urging improved care for the dying and those for whom no medical remedy is available. There is a need to promote policies which create conditions where human beings can bear even incurable illnesses and death in a dignified manner. Here, it is necessary to stress once again the need for more palliative care centers, which provide integral care, offering the sick the human assistance and spiritual accompaniment they need. This is a right belonging to every human being, one which we must all be committed to defend. I would add, although I would never add anything to a papal statement really, but in my head, I add, it's one which we must be committed to promote and to defend. And I'll take that up with Pope Benedict if I ever meet him. And our current Pope Francis. Within the first few months of his papacy, he started visiting hospitals, as you know, and that's something he had done when he was in Argentina as well. And he's been very eloquent about palliative care. This particular statement was delivered to a papal gathering of healthcare workers. Palliative care is an expression of the truly human attitude of taking care of one another, especially of those who suffer. Thus, I appreciate your scientific and cultural commitment to ensuring that palliative care may reach all those who need it. I encourage professionals and students to specialize in this type of assistance, which is no less valuable for the fact that it is not life-saving. That seems to be a sticking point in our faith community, that somehow it is not only not life-saving, but that it might be death-hastening. I can assure you there is nothing farther from the truth. Palliative care accomplishes something equally important. It values the person. I exhort all those who in various ways are involved in the field of palliative care to practice this task, keeping the spirit of service intact and remembering that all medical knowledge is truly science in its noblest significance, only if used as aid in view of the good of man, a good which is never accomplished against the life and dignity of man. So you couldn't get much better endorsements from the magisterium and from the head of our church. So the reluctance is something I don't understand, to embrace it and to work to figure out what palliative care is. And then finally, another reason to have this palliative care initiative, which makes, I think, it very much the work of the church, is that it is truly one of the few things that can almost point by point refute this tsunami of support for physician-assisted suicide that we are facing in our country. In the past legislative cycle in our country, 28 legislatures were contemplating physician-assisted suicide bills. You will all remember that in 2012 we had a ballot referendum here in Massachusetts which was narrowly defeated, 51.5% to 49.5% in Catholic Massachusetts. In California, in Oregon, in Washington, in Montana, in Vermont, and in New Mexico, physician-assisted suicide is now legal. So one of the things that we have to worry about is the fact that because only 5 states recognize physician-assisted suicide legally, we can't pat ourselves on the back too much, because the proponents see every single failure where a ballot referendum fails or a proposed piece of legislation does not get passed, somehow as success. Because with every campaign, we, the citizen public, are further desensitized to the horror of physician-assisted suicide. And think about it. You know, we're sitting here and nobody is going, what? Where's the moral outrage? Where's the part where we all go, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You don't hear it anymore. We're so used to it. So when you listen to the folks who are proponents of physician-assisted suicide, I use the expression that they like to play on a completely emotional playing field, because they tell us stories that are heart-wrenching. We will all remember the story of Brittany Menard. We heard about her in the news all the time. If you read People magazine, which I've become a devout follower of because, and I hadn't been, but because they are constantly promoting stories of physician-assisted suicide, and they're telling them in the most sympathetic way. You know, there would be something wrong with us if we did not get engaged in these stories and feel incredible compassion and sympathy for the individuals who are trying to get this bill passed. Their stories are heart-wrenching, as I said. And the moment we don't feel sorrow and compassion and sympathy, there's something wrong with us. But feeling sympathetic for them does not mean that we need to espouse their cause. But the proponents count on us to do what happened with abortion. They say, well, I might be personally against it, but I think it needs to be available for people. We can't go there. The way in which the proponents make the argument, as I said, is almost completely emotional. So they play on our fears of loss of dignity, of dependence, and of unmitigated pain. And the thing that's wonderful about palliative care is that it's the only thing that I have found from a policy level that actually refutes all of those arguments. The dignity is given because the patients drive the care plan. What are your needs at any given moment? That's where the emphasis is. Who is it that you are, and how did you get to be that person? We take all that into account. The people who are the most important to the patient become part of the care, both delivering it and receiving it. The advancements in the technology and the pharmaceuticals of pain relief has been huge. That is not to say that nowhere will anyone suffer pain again. That's a foolish promise that anybody would try to make. On the other hand, we all know that pain is exaggerated and exacerbated by other kinds of suffering, by anxiety, by feelings of loneliness, by depression. All of that is handled and taken care of in a palliative care program. The dependence part, I don't know. I think that while there may be physical dependence, I was laid up for over a year with a bad accident. I'm sure everybody here either has that story themselves or knows somebody who post-stroke, post-surgery, post-illness, post-whatever, had to rely on others to help them. It ain't so bad. If it's done in a dignified and respectful way, so what? Really, so what? And yet if you hear the lack of dignity and, the lack of independence, the way it's talked about in the proponents' stories, honestly, you would think it was the worst thing ever. So I don't know what we do about that except to say that's not so bad. And the fact of the matter is, I may be physically dependent. Somebody may have to help me walk or toilet or bathe or whatever, but I'm still the one in charge in a palliative care program. That is hardly dependence. And so we promote palliative care also as a refutation of the claims, the emotional claims that are made in physician-assisted suicide world. I don't generally also quote the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, not because I don't have great respect for the conference, I just don't generally know all of the things that they're writing and saying. But I love that when they talk about physician-assisted suicide, rather than kind of keep beating the drum, which we certainly know, and everybody, Catholic or not, knows that we see life as a gift from God, and we respect the sanctity of life. You don't have to keep saying that. The bishops, therefore, when they talked about physician-assisted suicide over the last few years, they have talked about it as a threat to good palliative care. When you recast the arguments, when you recast the challenge, it's kind of interesting. It makes you kind of get caught off guard and furthermore catch the proponents off guard. And that's important. That's what we have to start doing. So, one part of this initiative is also called advanced care planning. And advanced care planning is the real-life, real-time demonstration of how we show respect for the dignity of every person, because we're saying to people, what's important to you? Is it important to you to have so much pain medication, so much comfort that you perhaps can't relate as much with people? Or do you want us to kind of lighten up on the pain medication so that you can continue to interact? Do you want to be at home? Do you want to be in a hospital? Do you want to be in a residential hospice? Do you want to be in rehab? These are the kinds of ways in which people in advance can talk to their loved ones, and particularly the person that they designate as their healthcare proxy. I think you've all heard that expression and know what that is, but if you don't, Raise your hand, and I'm happy to define it. It's the person who, you didn't even raise your hand, and I'm telling you. It's the person who can stand in your place when you lose the capacity to speak for yourself, and they can speak for you and make decisions for you. So in advance, we can talk to those folks, the loved ones who are likely to be involved in our care, and particularly the proxy who is going to be legally empowered to make decisions for us. And we can talk about the kinds of scenarios that may occur in the course of our illness and what we would like to have happen, where we would like to have the care delivered, who we would like to have with us, etc. So we've been talking about palliative care, we've been talking about advanced care planning, and we haven't defined them. So I wanted to share some definitions with you that aren't necessarily out of the Catholic canon of literature, because palliative care is palliative care. And while decisions that we make in a palliative care plan for us who stand in a faith community are informed by that faith and the teachings of our church, palliative care is the same. The definitions are the same. So what I did was just grab a handful of palliative care definitions, and some of them will strike some of you, and some of them will be clearer to others of you. If you Googled it, you would get this kind of smattering of definitions. The first comes from CAPC. As you can see, that's the Center to Advance Palliative Care. It's a medical society that really has driven a lot of the innovations in care and the technology in care. Palliative care, also known as palliative medicine, is specialized medical care for people living with serious illness. It focuses on providing relief from symptoms and stress of a serious illness, whatever the diagnosis. The goal is to improve quality of life for both the patient and the family. Another one, and this comes from Mayo Clinic, because if you did Google palliative care, almost always Mayo Clinic comes, I don't know what their website people do to always make them almost the first or second item that comes up. But they should come up very early in a search because they're fantastic. And one of the things, in addition to good practice of clinical medicine, that they're fantastic about is the way in which they educate the general public on health issues. Palliative care offers pain and symptom management and emotional and spiritual support when you face a chronic, debilitating, or life-threatening illness. Pretty straightforward and pretty clear, and very similar to what we heard from the doctors group. Palliative care is an approach, this comes from World Health Organization, because the issues that we're talking about here are being talked about everywhere. We're all facing these issues. Palliative care is an approach that improves the quality of life for patients and their families facing the problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment of pain and other problems, physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. I want to call your attention to the fact that these are three very different sources. We could go on, we'd get similar definitions. What you won't get is the word death. What you won't get is end of life. What you won't get is hospice, because palliative care is not those things. If I could make a bumper sticker, I would say all hospice care is palliative care, but not all palliative care is hospice care. Palliative care is introduced at the moment of diagnosis of a serious, chronic, life-limiting illness. Another kind of cliched phrase that we use when we talk about palliative care is at any age, at any stage. So at any age of a patient, at any stage of an illness. Once we diagnose a serious illness that's life-limiting, palliative care ought to be invoked. Palliative care ought to be offered so that a team comes to meet with the patient and family and starts to know them right away and starts to develop a kind of care plan that can adjust as disease progresses, as circumstances change, as patients age, as the kind of map of support starts to look different. As people move away, as people the caregivers themselves become ill or die. It should be a flexible, dynamic thing that travels with the patient over the course of the disease. If it starts early enough, generally you don't see much of your palliative care team because you've just had the diagnosis, you're probably living pretty well. As time goes on And as the disease progresses, you may see more of them. You may see more of the chaplain at one time and the social worker another time, more of the physician at one time or the nurse at another time. It's flexible and it's dynamic, and it completely depends on the needs of a patient and family at any given moment. When we talk about any age, any stage, we really mean it. When we talk about life limiting, we mean not just life limiting in the sense of time, but also in the sense of function. So a child of 7 who is suddenly diagnosed with juvenile diabetes, perfect candidate for palliative care. The limitations on their function will be determined by the brittleness that children experience with diabetes in their youth, increased at the time that the hormones fly in, it's an endocrine disease, and then stabilizes more or less in adulthood. But along the way, there are implications for their kidneys, for their heart, for their lungs, for their circulation. At any age, at any stage, palliative care is appropriate. So those are a few definitions. There is one description of palliative care that I think is probably the most helpful. I'm going to share it with you here on this slide, but there are also handouts available and you can take them. This comes from a group called the Supportive Care Coalition. And this is a national network of Catholic healthcare systems, all of whom are working to promote and implement palliative care across the country. Palliative care implements a holistic, interdisciplinary care plan that identifies, assesses, and addresses the comprehensive needs of the seriously ill patient, including pain and other symptom management. You know, we focus so much on pain, but there are GI problems, there are neurologic pain, there is dermatologic itching that you scratch till you bleed, there are headaches, there's thinning hair, there are a lot of things that we can address in addition to pain. Psychosocial issues, I talked about the impact of illness, chronic serious illness on relationships. Have you ever seen the siblings of a chronically ill child where all the focus goes to the sick child and what happens to the others, right? Have you seen the stress on marriage that serious illness can have? So we look at the psychosocial issues, including how do we pay for these treatments, as importantly as we look at some of the other symptoms and pains that need to be managed. And then we spoke about the emotional roller coaster that people are on with these illnesses and the dramatic increase in the need for spiritual care. The interesting thing is, for those of us who have worked in palliative care, and particularly those of us who are people of faith who work in palliative care, we understand the incredible need for and importance of spiritual care in the care of people with serious illness. It is sometimes the last thing that the patients themselves realize they need. Sometimes they know right up front, other times they don't. So if you are yourself involved in the care of somebody with serious illness, be patient. Be patient with the patient and keep offering the spiritual care. That's particularly important in a faith community. I don't know any of the parishes here well enough to know if there are visitation of the sick programs, if there are parish nurse programs. I would imagine there are all of those. There certainly are communion visitations and sacrament of the sick visits. They're all wonderful opportunities for beginning to open the conversation and open the doors for the spiritual care piece. Palliative care begins at the moment of diagnosis with a life-limiting illness. It's not restricted to end-of-life care, but it is the model used in hospice care of the dying. And most people are more familiar with hospice care and that phrase than palliative care. I will tell you that many times even healthcare professionals see them as synonymous, and they are not. As I keep saying, palliative care is something that can be initiated at the very moment of diagnosis. And the hope of people who are involved in palliative care is that that involvement continues over days, months, weeks, years, decades. It is not end-of-life care, but end-of-life care certainly should be palliative care. You don't stop because somebody is now actively or imminently dying. Palliative care can be delivered simultaneously with treatments aimed at curing or delivered by itself when curing is no longer an option. If some of you have been familiar with hospice care, the rule until very recently for most hospices was that you were not permitted entry into a hospice program until you were finished with chemo. That chemo was providing no further benefit, or other kinds of curative treatment were no longer an option. Some hospices are beginning to loosen that restriction, but not most, and certainly those that are Medicare funded are not dropping that restriction. Palliative care, on the other hand, is the same kind of care, because hospice care is based on the palliative care model, but it does not require that you stop attempts to cure the disease. That's an important distinction for you to know and for you to share with loved ones. Palliative care planning is initiated with the conversations between patients and providers at the moment of diagnosis and following, patient and family, patient and support network, that results in the creation of advanced care planning documents. I referred to that a little while ago, and we'll go into further detail, particularly with the designation of a healthcare proxy for decision making when the patient no longer has capacity to do so. In Catholic healthcare, there's a booklet with directives that reflect church teaching that pertain to healthcare and the delivery of healthcare. This little booklet came from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and it is called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Healthcare Services. We shorten it to ERDs in healthcare. In the ERDs, in the directives, there are very specific directives that tell us why we should and that we should encourage advanced care planning and the participation of patients in constructing their goals of care and the care plan. So I've given you a few citations of those ERDs if you get your hands on the booklet. When people talk about the ERDs, when I first came into Catholic healthcare many years ago, I honestly thought when people talked about the ERDs that it was like the Oxford English Dictionary and that it would take up several shelves of the library, and dear God, how do you learn them? It's a booklet about this big. It's not even 8 by 11, it's 4 by 11, and it's pretty darn concise. Every single word of every directive has been so carefully crafted and wordsmithed, and it's tremendously helpful. It both reflects and summarizes church teaching as it directly applies to a lot of the decision making that we have in healthcare, and particularly in the face of serious illness. So, some of the kind of definitional terms of palliative care: compassionate, comprehensive, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, because these disciplines that are reflected really integrate and work well together. Patient-driven, family-centered. It's just as aggressive as curative therapies are known to be, just with a different focus. And it's supportive. Really, the key word is supportive. It supports the patient, it supports the family, it supports the staff who are caring for these folks, it supports the community. In Catholic healthcare, we often talk about the fact that we are there to attend to the needs of the whole patient. This, every aspect of how we define our humanity, our physical needs, our psychological needs, our spiritual needs, our social needs, our emotional needs, they're all attended to in palliative care. One of the things that's nice about palliative care is that it's so customized to the needs of the specific patient and their support network at any given moment. So I mentioned before that the care plan is fluid and it's dynamic because circumstances change, diseases progress, financial abilities change, people disappear, between the mobility of our society and the fact that sometimes the proxy we asked to make decisions in our stead has developed dementia, has moved away and is not available, has herself become sick, has died himself. So at any given moment, we want to make sure that what is customized is not static. We need to make sure that we are constantly revisiting the care plan, the designation of the proxy. We want to make sure that the person who is designed and designated, rather, to be our surrogate is kept apprised of what's happening. What has happened in our healthcare lives that impact decisions that he or she will be allowed to make on our behalf when we can no longer speak for ourselves. When we use that phrase, no longer speak for ourselves, most time people think that means you lose the intellectual capacity. Either you're in a coma, or you've developed dementia, or something has happened that you're not neurologically capable. It may be that you're very much sound of mind, but unable to articulate things. So after a neurological event, after some disease that has robbed you of your speech, those are all instances in which the proxy is now authorized to make decisions for you. One of the other things that's interesting is that we often see in healthcare that the proxy inserts him or herself out of care, mostly out of the best intentions, into the decision-making apparatus because they are the proxy. And one of the things that we want to remind everybody is that that status becomes activated when your status becomes deactivated. So as long as you can think and speak for yourself, the proxy actually has no business in doing anything that you don't bring them into, that you don't invite them to be a sounding board. So we've had proxies, and well-intentioned, as I say, come in and ask to look at the record or get a copy of the record just to have. They aren't legally allowed to do any of that until the moment arrives when the person for whom they are the proxies become incapacitated. So I just want to remind all of us about that. I have to tell you, as you heard, I'm a bioethicist and a lawyer. I've pulled that trick myself. And you can sometimes get away with it, but we really shouldn't. One of the things that when I'm describing these kind of aspects and definitions of palliative care, I find myself thinking all the time, shouldn't this be all care? Shouldn't all care be customized? Shouldn't all care be revolving around the needs of the patient and the family at any given moment? If we watch Dr. Welby, and I'm looking around the room, and except for my niece, I think most of us remember Dr. Welby, whether we ever watched it or not. Dr. Welby did palliative care for an ingrown fingernail. He just knew the patient, he knew the family, he tended to the family's ills while he was, trimming the nail. He worried about their well-being in every possible way. So, now we have this subspecialty. It's the fastest growing subspecialty in medicine, palliative care is. But oughtn't it just not to be what we do for each other and in healthcare all the time? So the elements of palliative care, we talked about advanced care planning, pain and symptom management, spiritual care, psychosocial care, and emotional support. The candidates, I kind of mentioned the kid with diabetes, but these are other candidates at any age, at any stage in the care of somebody with a serious illness. So these are examples. It is not just for the frail elderly, it is not just for the dying. Anyone with a serious, chronic, or life-limiting illness. So we've talked about this. Just won't read it to you again because I've said it so many times. But I do want to stress that if at the moment of diagnosis for yourself or for a loved one, a doctor or nurse does not bring up palliative care, then everybody, the patient or the proxy if the patient is without capacity to speak for her or himself, the family members, everybody should ask, what about palliative care? Isn't this a situation for palliative care? Do you have access to a palliative care team? Can you refer us to palliative care? You will see in this, these handouts that I have for you, there's enough literature there, and these are just 2 little sheets of paper, but to kind of spur the conversation on with your providers. One other way to get palliative care, if you cannot get it through your own provider or the facility where you receive your care, the hospital or the outpatient facility, you can ask them to refer you to one of the home health agencies. I actually polled a few of them on the Cape to see, do you offer palliative care? Almost all of them do. You can't self-refer to home health. You probably all know this, but you can't self-refer, but you can get a referral from your doctor. Many of the hospice agencies have realized that the model of care, this palliative care model that they use, is actually now being used much further upstream at the time of diagnosis. And so many of them are now offering both kind of service lines, hospice care for the dying and palliative care for those who are coping with serious illness over the long haul, hopefully over the long haul. But feel free to kind of instigate the conversation and initiate get the referral initiated for yourselves. So this is how it's done. We kind of talked about that. These are some of the topics that could be addressed, and as you can see, there are a lot of them that you've already heard about: the spiritual needs, the psychosocial concerns, the pain and other symptom management, the emotional roller coaster. In palliative care, if you haven't already selected a proxy decision maker, that ought to be addressed, and you will learn about the criteria for who that ought to be. Somebody that you're comfortable talking with about your life and the course of your illness. Somebody who is readily available. So you don't really want to get your favorite person but who happens to live on the West Coast. You don't want somebody who is themselves so physically or perhaps intellectually challenged that this would be a bigger task than they're up for or that they're available for. It has to be somebody that you can brief and update. I was recently at a facility, a retirement home, doing a consultation, and when I got there, I was told the story of a person who had lost capacity over the weekend. There were several important decisions that had to be made having to do with code status and resuscitation and things like that, and they called the person listed as the proxy because the patient had lost capacity to speak, and the proxy said, "This is the first I'm hearing that I am the proxy. Good luck with that." And you know what? He was right. He was right. He would have no business really coming in to just make decisions of such great import without ever having been told that he was the proxy, without having some inkling of what this person's wishes were, without some real up-to-date knowledge of what are the values, what's the status, what is the hope for recovery, what is the benefit to be gained from each of the interventions that are being proposed. That's the responsibility of the proxy. So unlike some decisions that you make with your lawyer and then leave them in a box until you're no longer around, i.e. a will, when you designate a proxy, tell everybody. Tell everybody. There's nothing confidential about it, but start with the proxy. The reason to tell everybody is, one, so that in case the document can't be found, the word is out there. But there's another reason. Some of you may have been involved when very, very caring and concerned family members gather around someone's bedside, all of whom think they know this person best, and they know what this person would want. Out of the best of hearts and compassion, they want to make the decisions, and yet the person over here who's claiming that intimacy and knowledge is in conflict with the person over here. So it's very important that we tell our proxies and tell anybody else who's likely to be involved with us towards the end of our life or in an emergency, in an unintended or unanticipated moment, who is your proxy? And then keep the conversational ball rolling. Other decisions to be made in the course of advanced care planning. Where would you like to be? Many people want to be at home. That's kind of the classic. I want to be at home. I want to be at home until I die. I want to die in my own bed. There are other people who, last thing they want to do is have that be the place where they die and make it uncomfortable for their survivors. It's all very personal, but you've got to kind of have these conversations. Hospitalizations and readmissions. You know, at a certain point you have to say, what is the point of recurring hospitalizations when you're going back several times within a several week period, several month period? Is there something to be gained from these hospitalizations? Some people find it reassuring to go back even if nothing changes. Others say, you know what, I don't need to keep making that trip. I don't need to keep making the trip. I know what's going on. My doctors and I know what's going on. This isn't about refusal of treatment. It's that there's no benefit to be gained. These are all conversations that you have to have with your provider, with your family members. You can let your provider tell the family members. Many of us in small towns, the EMTs know us personally. They've done the run so many times. And they're asking, are you sure you want to go? Sometimes they're saying, you don't want to go. So these are conversations that need to be held. This is not at all about euthanasia, and this isn't even about refusing treatment. It's about what is the benefit, what is the purpose. And there's, in many cases in chronic illness, you can tell what the benefits are. We know in advance. So these are conversations that we're not used to having and we need to have. Resuscitation, we generally, if any of us have been hospitalized, if we've been hospitalized, we get asked that question. Do you want to be a DNR? Do you want resuscitation? Well, what does that mean? And what does it mean in my context? In the face of the disease I have, is there a benefit to that? Sometimes resuscitation is more dangerous than it's beneficial. You need to know that. Ongoing curative treatments like chemo, like dialysis, like surgery, like transfusions, like exotic medications that are very, very costly with very little hope of actual proportionate benefit. So, and medically administered nutrition and hydration, better known as tube feedings. Very important conversation to have. Many people think not to have them is to starve or thirst a person to death. The fact of the matter is, tube feedings were invented for very small, very temporary purposes, and the ability to completely nourish somebody from them is marginal at best, and for most of us, non-existent. It was meant to be something that was introduced temporarily to get us over a surgery, to get us over a blockage in our throat, to get us over a muscle thing that was keeping us from being able to swallow, that kind of thing. The absorption of actual nutrients, in many cases of people who are already compromised, minimal. So those are important conversations to have. Why are we doing this? When I was a young student in ethics, this is like long ago, I can remember then we talked about just because we can do something, should we do something? You know, you're shifting from the physically possible, the financially feasible, the available, to the moral category of question. Should we do it? We're not asking that enough, and we have more technology than ever. These are conversations we need to have with our loved ones, but first and foremost with our providers to get the information. So, palliative care and advanced care planning is informed by church teaching. You'll see some of the citations there. I've given you some already. And by previous advanced care planning discussions that we should have on an ongoing basis with our loved ones and with our proxy. We've already kind of defined advanced care planning, but here are a couple of definitions, and I'll let you read them yourselves if you can. If you can't, just raise your hand. But it's really about learning about the types of decisions that need to be made, considering them in advance, not necessarily making them, because you want to have the decisions made in real time based on real facts. That's the thing about advanced care planning that you want to be aware of all the time. It's not something that you cut in stone in 20 years, and when you actually need to invoke them several decades later, that you haven't reconsidered, where am I? Where is technology? Where is the benefit to be gained? It's a process of communications, whether between yourself and your family, between yourself and your provider, and most importantly, between yourself and your proxy. And it's about being able to both make decisions or articulate them. And we've defined them. I won't do this again for you, but these are the documents and the tools that help in advanced care planning. Most of them have to do with how you designate a proxy, a healthcare proxy, a durable power of attorney for a healthcare living will. I throw that in there just to tell you, if you live in Massachusetts, we don't recognize a living will. You hear people use the phrase all the time, it's not legal in Massachusetts. The Archdiocese of Boston has a booklet online that you can look at. So does the Archdiocese of Manchester. I don't believe Fall River has one. I looked a year or two ago and they didn't have one. I think they look at those too. Then there are others out there that you may have seen. They're to just stimulate conversation. Most importantly, you're the most important tool in advanced care planning discussions. So, we talked about those. The sources of the teaching are the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, their ethical and religious directives, papal statements, and church teaching generally, having to do with healthcare and having to do with the social tradition of Catholic Church. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions, and thank you again for this tremendous opportunity to be here with all of you.
If there are any questions or comments relative to Attorney Sullivan's presentation, we invite you to come up to the microphone because things are being, or you can whisper the question to me and I'll ask it, but we need the microphone because we are putting this on video for different parishes so you can watch it on our parish websites. So that's why we need the mic. So do not be afraid if you have a question.
I've heard that phrase before.
Well, of course, we're all running the road race this weekend, so, you know.
You're all so fit. Yes.
Sure. The question was, priests or deacons in our various dioceses, are we trained specifically for palliative care to be that agent?
Right, right. To be the agent, you mean the healthcare agent as in Proxy, or the
No, as
the
to be
person
kind
delivering?
of on that team as
Right.
the spiritual, because many times, and I
Right.
think, many times you'd say, well, of course, call the priest.
Yes,
but
that's right.
are we...
Many priests are out of personal interest. They, in the course of their seminary training, may have done a thing called clinical pastoral education. But for the most part, the person who is doing the spiritual care as part of a palliative care team, an official palliative care team, is a trained chaplain. And that is an education process that not every priest has undergone, and some have. And many lay people have undergone. So sometimes it's a lay person. The reason for looking for a trained chaplain who has done this clinical pastoral education is because sometimes the decisions that patients or their families or their proxies are wrestling with are fairly sophisticated in terms of what is the impact of a clinical intervention or not doing a clinical intervention, of withholding a certain treatment or withdrawing a certain treatment. It's helpful to have somebody who can fully participate in that discussion. I should say, in line with your question, one of the wonderful things about palliative care is the place, the respect, the dignity, the credibility that chaplaincy has been given. Too many times, chaplains in the past were kind of the afterthought. If someone didn't, at the beginning of the process, at admission, did not state their religion, did not ask for a visit from the chaplain or pastoral care department, spiritual care department, it was just something that you hoped a nurse or a physician remembered somewhere along the care line. But now the chaplain is considered so integral that many times, you know, the doc will stop in and then go back and report to the team or the nurse. It may be the chaplain, and their report is seen as valid and as credible and as important as a doc or nurses or social workers. But to answer your question, it's typically someone who is specially trained in clinical pastoral education. Thank you.
I've been a hospice volunteer for 15 years.
Thank you.
And I also work at Dana-Farber, so I have an extension. I have gone to the Archdiocese of Boston's meetings, and I'm interested in working with them because I have done a lot in the palliative care, not only with the patient, but with the caregiver. They are, when I first come to a home, that's the first thing I have to see. I have to see each one of them separately because we sometimes don't take enough care of the caregiver.
That's right.
And I'm always at, what do you like to do, what can you do, etc. But I'm very interested, and I think that you did mention, did you speak at the last meeting?
I did.
I thought you did because I spoke to you then. I wanted to say that you had said you were going to open it up and to ask the parishes to have people who were interested, and that we were going to have meetings, and I volunteered for my parish in Franklin. But I just wanted people to know that we are in our diocese, and most likely in other dioceses, are doing a great deal to prepare people to do this work, even if they don't get a college degree in it.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot that can be done just in being kind.
What's your name?
My name is Joan McGuire.
Joan, thank you so much for bringing that up. I didn't want to talk about my initiative too much here. I've crossed the bridge. I'm in a different diocese. But what Joan is referring to is the fact that in the initiative that we started just about 16 months ago, I said to the Cardinal when we first started talking about this, This initiative is wonderful in terms of going out and speaking like this and telling people about palliative care, making the link as we face yet again a threat from physician-assisted suicide legalization attempts. It's wonderful, but it will only really make a difference if it becomes organic. And in order for this project to become organic, at every parish, or in our archdiocese, some of them have combined and we call them collaboratives, at every parish and collaborative, there needs to be a resource group who will, within that community, continue to keep palliative care alive and well by virtue of going out to folks who call saying, I've just been diagnosed with a serious illness, and talking to them about palliative care, helping them to talk to their providers about getting palliative care, staging workshops and talks and presentations on a regular basis in the parish so that folks are constantly learning not just about definitions of palliative care as we did tonight, but what are some of the decisions? How do you know about church teaching on tube feedings? What does the church tell us about pain management and to what extent we can go? What is the principle of double effect? Those kinds of things. So that on a regular basis, parishioners are beginning to make palliative care part of their kind of daily regime, not something that they do homework on, but are exposed to on a regular basis. So we're just starting. We've done train the trainer workshops. We've had the first national colloquium in the first year. We'll have another train the trainer workshop in the fall, and we are beginning to get people to sign up to be the resources within the parishes. I met with Bishop D'Acunha because he and I sit on a board together, and he wanted to hear about it for the Fall River Diocese. So we're beginning to continue that conversation. So you may be hearing about this opportunity here in your own parishes as well.
How does palliative care get reimbursed?
Great question. There are several ways in which it gets reimbursed. Palliative care is not exotica. It's just good care, as I said in one of the slides. And so many times the elements of palliative care have reimbursement codes. There is a tremendous amount of work being done on Beacon Hill and most particularly on Capitol Hill with Medicare to get a palliative care code, and it's making progress. Part of the job that I do, it's educational outreach, it's dealing with some of the ethics questions, but a large part of what I do is advocacy, and I've spent more time than I'd like to document on Beacon Hill and Capitol Hill, meeting with lawmakers, telling them about palliative care, explaining about the bills that are currently pending, so that we hope that palliative care will be reimbursable by Medicare very soon. There's a bill that's very close to passage. It has tremendous bipartisan support. And then once, generally the process, and you probably all know this, once Medicare has coded something for reimbursement, the insurance companies don't have a lot of choice but to fall into line as well. But I do want to tell you all something about what's happening in Massachusetts. This is public knowledge now, so I'm not betraying any confidences. It was in the Boston Globe last December and in May. The CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts is a wonderful man named Andrew Dreyfus, and he called me about a year ago and came to my office at the Archdiocese and said that he had experienced death in two very dramatically different ways, one horrible and one wonderful, and they were his parents who had very different dying and death experiences. And he came away from that saying, I'm in the business of providing the resource to get care. And he said, we're not doing it very well, particularly for those with serious illness, and hence the rise of things like physician-assisted suicide attempts at legalization. So he has pulled together a coalition of all kinds of partners that may not agree on a lot in the real world, but on one thing that they all agree is that there needs to be better care made available and reimbursable for people with serious illness. And he has formed, it's a very straightforward title, the Coalition for Better Care of the Seriously Ill. He has started by putting his money where his mouth is. He has funded the first couple of years of this coalition. There are people and agencies from across the state. Our initiative is one of the kind of members as well. And he has also, and this is the important thing, begun to make changes in his own company with the full support of the board. I mean, he's not acting autocratically. This has come about as a result of a lot of strategic discussions and planning sessions. But they are now providing not just funding and a reimbursement code in the Blue Cross Blue Shield world for things like advanced care planning discussions between patients and providers. That time has never been reimbursable for physicians, and it's important time. When you don't want them to just do it quickly on the sidewalk, you want them to take a serious period of their working day and spend it with patients and families talking about what should we do now that we have this diagnosis? What are the things we need to start thinking about and planning for? And so he's started that. So that's the other thing he's done. In addition, you know how almost every healthcare plan has wellness programs for those they cover, those they insure. He is also, there's all kinds of incentive things. He's giving HSA dollars for people who complete a proxy form. He has really begun to say, what are the pieces that folks are avoiding doing this work, having these conversations, making these documents? Why are they not doing it on the doctor's side and on the patient side? And he's addressing them in very real life, real world terms. So, it's a competitive market out there. Once one insurance company like that starts to do it, the others are going to notice and probably fall in line. So we have the government and we have the private sector starting to make a difference. Very long answer to your question, but it's coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good news, right?
Take one more. Sure. Patriots are on.
Hurry. No, I'm kidding. We can all listen on our radios on the way home.
Is that too loud? I have an aunt who's 93 who has no paperwork done, and every time I bring it up, it doesn't go very far. Do you have any suggestions?
It's very difficult. There are a couple of ways to do it. One is like, I was going to say the Chinese water torture thing, but that sounds really harsh and I don't mean it. But, sometimes there's a drip, drip, drip and you just have to keep at it and it works finally. Sometimes, and this sounds equally harsh and I don't mean it in either way to be harsh, but there is the scare tactic of telling the stories and the real life stories of what happens when people have not.
I've tried that.
You've tried that, yeah. Sometimes, I know this is true in most families, sometimes you need a different voice because you're just the kid niece. I could be 80 and I will still be my mother's little girl or my aunt's little niece or whatever. Sometimes you need another voice, and it might be...
Just me.
It might be a social worker or somebody from the parish or somebody, if there were just a palliative care resource group around. Somebody like that, perhaps, the sad thing is many people will go without anything. I don't know your aunt at all, obviously, so I don't know how impressed she would be by other things like the news of this coalition. If you went to their website, you can see all kinds of anecdotes and stories that are meant to persuade people to finally tackle this task. It's a scary one. Two things I would say. It's scary because we are a death-denying culture, that we're a death-denying species for the most part, but we're getting better at talking about it. Look at this. I mean, I can tell you, I was laughing on my way in the door saying I'm used as well to seeing 5 people at some of these sessions, and here we have, a full audience. Yay, thank you. But we are a death-denying culture. So it may be that you will never get her to kind of move around. We also have a generational difference. Where we didn't tell doctors what to do, we didn't ask them why they're doing it, we just left it in their hands, God's hands, and let nature take its course. We have so many cliches for this. So I don't have any trick. There's no magic wand. You just have to keep on slugging. Sometimes, I will tell you, I don't know if she has a will, but
Nothing.
most general lawyers, I mean, the way to get somebody to do a will is to say, really, you want the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to take everything? Because that's what happens. That is what happens. Lawyers will tell you that. If you die intestate, it's called, the state just steps in. But the other piece is that now the lawyers who do wills automatically ask people who's your healthcare agent, who will be your proxy. And that's a whole different way of going about it. More people, sorry Mom, in my mother's generation have now done healthcare proxy designation that they would not have perhaps done if their kids asked them or if somebody else asked them. But when a lawyer just hands it out as part of the process, that's gone a long way to getting these things done.
Thank you.
Sorry, maybe we can chat offline about it.
No, I think that's an excellent question, because I think in so many respects it is difficult to have these conversations with particularly our own relatives, and so I can certainly appreciate what you were saying.
Yeah.
And I want to express our appreciation on behalf of our parish communities down here for a tremendously informative presentation this evening. We thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please help yourself for some refreshments before